The Secret Garden, Chapter 7, Nest Building. The rain continued for another week. Unable to go out, Mary spent hours of every day with Colin in his room, talking and looking at his many splendid books. Sometimes Mary read things to Colin, and sometimes he read to her, but mostly they talked. Mary tried to be very cautious about the secret garden. She wanted to discover if Colin was the kind of boy you could tell a secret to. He was not in the least like Dickon, but he was evidently so pleased with the idea of a garden that no one knew anything about that she thought perhaps he could be trusted. Mary wondered if it might not be possible for Colin to actually visit the secret garden some day. Perhaps if he had a great deal of fresh air and knew Dickon and the robin and saw things growing, he might not think so much about dying. But there had already been a change in Colin since Mary had become his friend, though she did not know it. Before, not a day would go by without his throwing a tantrum or having a fit. Now it had been a week, and he had been almost pleasant the entire time. But what amazed Mrs. Medlock and the other servants most during this amazing week was the constant sound of laughter that burst forth from Colin's room. On the first morning, when the sky was blue again, Mary wakened very early. She opened the window, and a great waft of fresh, scented air blew in upon her. "I can't wait," she cried. "I'm going to see the garden." She put on her clothes quickly and ran to the garden, and there she found Dickon kneeling on the grass, already hard at work. "Oh, Dickon, Dickon," she called out, "how could you get here so early? The sun has only just come up." "Eh?" he said, glowing. "I was up long before the sun. I couldn't have stayed away. Why, the garden was lying here waiting." The garden was full of wonders that morning. New green points pushing through the earth, swelling leaf buds on rose branches that once had seemed dead, whole clumps of crocuses burst into purple and orange and gold, and in the midst of them was a wonder more delightful than all. The robin was building a nest. "He's like us," Dickon said in a hushed voice. "Us is near to being wild things ourselves. Us is nest building too." It was then that Mary told Dickon about Colin, about the midnight howling of the wind, and the far-off cries, and the small ivory-white face, and the strange black-rimmed eyes. "Them's just like his mother's eyes, only hers was always laughing, they say," said Dickon, who had known about Colin from Martha. "They say Mr. Craven can't bear to see him when he's awake, because his eyes is so like his mother's." "Do you think he wants to die?" whispered Mary. "No, but he wishes he'd never been born. Mother says that them is not wanted scarce ever thrives. His father would like to forget he's on earth. For one thing, he's afraid he'll look at him some day and find he's growed hunchback." "Colin's so afraid of it himself that he won't sit up," said Mary. "If he was out here," Dickon said, "he wouldn't be watching for lumps to grow on his back. He'd be watching for buds to break on the rose bushes, and he'd likely be healthier." Mary agreed. "I wonder if we could bring him out here without anyone seeing us," she said. "Us'll have him out here sometime for sure," said Dickon stoutly. "I could push his carriage well enough. He could lie out under the trees." "He'd be like us then," Mary said. "Aye," said Dickon, "two lads and a lass just looking on at the springtime, watching a garden grow." They found a great deal to do that morning, and Mary was late in returning to the house. She was also in such a hurry to get back to her work that she quite forgot Colin until the last moment. "Tell Colin that I can't come and see him yet," she said to Martha. "I'm very busy." Martha looked rather frightened. "Eh, Miss Mary," she said, "it may make him angry when I tell him that." But Mary was not as afraid of him as other people were. "I can't stay," she answered. "Dickon's waiting for me," and she ran away. When she returned late that afternoon, she found Colin lying flat on his back in bed. Mary marched up to him, her lips pinched tightly together. "Why didn't you get up?" she demanded. "I did get up this morning when I thought you were coming," he answered without looking at her. "I made them put me back in bed this afternoon. My back ached and my head ached and I was tired. Why didn't you come?" "I was with Dickon," said Mary. Colin frowned. "I won't let you see that boy if you go and stay with him instead of coming to talk to me," he said. Mary had no patience with Colin sulking. "If you send Dickon away, I'll never come into this room again," she retorted. "You'll have to if I want you," said Colin. "I won't," said Mary. "I'll make you," said Colin. "They shall drag you in." Then great angry words flew between them. Each accused the other of being most selfish. I'm not as selfish as you because I'm always ill, and I'm sure there is a lump coming on my back, said Colin, and I am going to die besides. You're not, contradicted Mary unsympathetically. He opened his eyes quite wide with indignation. He had never heard such a thing said before. I'm not, he cried. I am. You know I am. Everybody says so. I don't believe it, said Mary sourly. In spite of his invalid back, Colin sat up in bed in quite a healthy rage. Get out of the room, he shouted, and he caught hold of his pillow and threw it at her. I'm going, she said, and I won't come back. That night Mary was awakened by the most dreadful noises. Colin was having a tantrum. I felt the lump. I felt it, he choked out when Mary entered his room. I knew I should. I shall have a hunch on my back, and then I shall die. And he turned on his face and sobbed and sobbed. Stop it, Mary said fiercely. You didn't feel a lump. All that ails you is hysterics and temper. Nurse, she commanded, come here and show me his back this minute. The nurse, Mrs. Medlock, and Martha had been standing huddled together near the door, staring at her, their mouths half open. The nurse came forward almost as if she were afraid. Show her, Colin gasped out between two sobs. She'll see then. It was a poor thin back to look at when it was bared. There was just a minute's silence. Even Colin tried to hold his breath while Mary looked up and down his spine. There's not a single lump there, she said at last. There's not a lump as big as a pin, except backbone lumps, and you can only feel them because you're thin. If you ever say there is a lump again, I shall laugh. No one but Colin himself knew what effect those crossly spoken words had on him. If he had ever had anyone to talk to about his secret terrors, if he had had childish companions and had not lain on his back in the huge closed house, he would have found out that most of his fright and illness was created by himself, and now that an angry, unsympathetic little girl insisted that he was not as ill as he thought, he actually felt as if she might be speaking the truth. Do you think I could live to grow up? He asked. You probably will if you do not give way to your temper, said the nurse, and if you stay out a great deal in the fresh air. Weak and worn out with crying, Colin put out his hand toward Mary, and her own anger having passed, she met him halfway with her hand, so that it was a sort of making up. I'll go out with you, Mary, he said. I shan't hate fresh air if we can find... He remembered just in time to stop himself from saying, if we can find the secret garden. And he ended, I shall like to go out with you if Dickon will come and push my chair. The nurse remade the tumbled bed and straightened the pillows. Then she made Colin a cup of tea and gave a cup to Mary, who really was very glad to get it after her excitement. I will stay with him until he goes to sleep, Mary said to the yawning nurse. You can go if you like. The nurse was out of the room in a minute, and as soon as she was gone, Colin pulled Mary's hand again. I almost told, he said, but I stopped myself in time. Oh, Mary, if I could get into the garden, I think I should live to grow up. Do you suppose you could tell me again what you imagine it looks like inside? I am sure it will help me go to sleep. Yes, answered Mary, shut your eyes. He closed his eyes and lay quite still, and she held his hand and began to speak very slowly and in a very low voice. I think it has been left alone so long that it has grown all into a lovely tangle. I think the roses have climbed and climbed and climbed, and now they hang from the branches and walls and creep over the ground, almost like a strange gray mist. Some of them died, but many are alive, and when the summer comes there will be curtains and fountains of roses. I think the ground is full of daffodils and snowdrops and lilies and irises, working their way out of the dark. Now the spring has begun. Perhaps there are clusters of purple crocuses. Perhaps the leaves are beginning to break out, and the gray is changing, and a green veil is creeping over everything, and the birds are coming to look at it, because it is so safe and still, and perhaps the robin has found a mate and is building a nest. And Colin was asleep.